Hi, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable, The Police and Ferguson, After Ferguson, Extrajudicial Violence, Race, and the Role of Anthropology. I'm Shalini Shankar. I teach at Northwestern University, and it was a privilege to organize this roundtable as a part of the Committee on Minority Issues in Anthropology, the CMIA. Two former CMIA members, Lawrence Cohen and Mayanthi Fernando, were also instrumental in developing the panel abstract with me, and I'm grateful for their collaboration. The impetus for this panel needs little explanation in today's fraught landscape of racialized policing, violence, activism, and protest. It spans the killings of young African American men, the response to the lack of justice served in response, the ongoing dehumanization of individuals at the hands of armed security in high schools, colleges, and on city and suburban streets, and the virulent racism that has led to the protests on college campuses across the country. Amid these events and the relentless media cycle that covers them, what can and must anthropology offer? How does our discipline, comforted by its platitudes of familiar and strange, attend to these highly problematic issues? Beyond critically interrogating key moments, such as the activism fostered by Eric Garner's I Can't Breathe, or the embodied stances of Hands Up, Don't Shoot by celebrities and athletes alike, anthropology is very well positioned to apply its expertise and knowledge on policing, social justice, and criminality to lay the foundation for substantive long-term change. The discipline furthers understandings and linkages of events of the United States to international locations of settler colonialism and violence, for instance, comparative approaches to the state and policing to which Palestinians are subject. Anthropology can also attend to the modalities across which such messages travel, including social media, especially Black Twitter, and the widely followed activists, including D. Ray, Netta, and others, who connect daily with on-the-ground efforts distributing vital information on Black Lives Matter and other movements. Much can be learned and emulated in our efforts by how these activists track and circulate the rising anti-Black Lives Matter sentiments and how they systematically critique attempts at co-option and delegitimization, such as All Lives Matter. So in light of these and other events, as you may know, the AAA recently created a task force on police brutality and extrajudicial violence. This task force, in effect, I believe since April, has a charge that is thoughtful and far-reaching, but one that clearly cannot be accomplished alone. As part of our work on this task force, we're building a database of experts on topics of racialized policing. If anyone in the audience considers themselves an expert on this topic, and you're willing to, or if you're willing to put us in touch with colleagues who are, please consider putting your name, email, and address, and areas of specialization on this sheet that I will pass around. So it's not just a general sign-in sheet for attending, but if you actually have expertise and are willing to speak to media or be a resource as we develop kits to distribute to educators on how to handle these issues, we'd really appreciate your information. So our panelists today explore anthropological forms and methods of analysis that are needed and possible for furthering racial justice. The esteemed presenters draw on anthropological teaching and writing and scholarly life more generally to reconsider the discipline's role in driving change in ideology and everyday practice surrounding these issues. As you'll see, the scholars here are as much astute commentators on the complex events and processes that engender racialized violence and collective response as they are thought leaders on how to move forward from this point on in ways that bridge academia and the public sphere. I'll now turn it over to our presenters. Lee Baker, who is joining us via Skype. He's at Duke University. At the end of the table, at the far end of the table, is Raymond Codrington, who is at CUNY, among other places. Leith Mullings, who is at CUNY as well. John Jackson, who is at University of Pennsylvania. Yarimar Bonilla, who is at Rutgers, and Jonathan Rosa, who is at Stanford. So the format is as follows. They'll each speak for anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, and followed by a discussion between the panelists, in which I may introduce a few themes that emerge for general discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience, because this is I think the real benefit of a session like this is to hear what other viewpoints people bring to these questions and the kinds of things they think we should be discussing as anthropologists. So there is a mic in the middle of the room for that portion of the program. Thank you. How do I get Lee to be on the big screen? I'm addressing this question to no one.
There he is.
Oh, he's there. Hi, thank you. I want the rest of my life to be this simple. Okay.
And I took it off. Thank you so much, Shalani. I can't see everyone, but I can hear myself. I think we can get.
Yeah, the sound is odd. 1 second. Is there a way to do something with sound?
Testing. Testing. Well, I'll just start. We'll see how it goes. It's too annoying because I don't know where the volume is on this computer. No, we're in a conference center thing, so. Okay. All right, thank you. On August 9th, 2014, walking down the street, Ferguson, Missouri, 18-year-old Michael Brown encountered police officer Darren Wilson. Minutes later, Officer Wilson shot the unarmed teen 6 times, twice in the head. Brown's body remained on Canfield Drive as a public display of state violence. Ferguson was fed up. As the Department of Justice report documented, the police harassment and intimidation of the town's largely Black citizenry was not only routine, but an institutionalized form of revenue generation, which accounted for a whopping 19% of the township's operating budget. As the City of Ferguson's budget memo for fiscal year 13-14 stated, due to a more concentrated focus on traffic enforcement, municipal court revenues have risen about 44%, or $620,000. 10-11. Total court revenues are expected to reach $2,029,000 in fiscal year 13-14, a revenue stream higher than property taxes. Whether or not people in Ferguson recognized that they were paying fines and court costs and property taxes, they certainly felt the toll as the legal system was taking on their town. People of Ferguson were indeed fed up, protesting for 100 days. The media storm that covered the protests and massive show of violence in Missouri led President Obama to send Eric Holder down to be the commander-in-chief. The world watched as Ferguson protesters were tear gassed, yet came back night after night. The nascent and social media savvy Black Lives Matter movement formed in the wake of violence in the summer of 14. It felt like there was a new awareness of police violence, mass incarceration, systematic exploitation of women. However, when Sabrina Fulton, Mother Trayvon Martin, published her open letter to the Brown family in Time magazine, she poignantly shifted and expanded the frame for many Americans. She wrote, "I hate that you and your family must join this exclusive and growing group of parents and relatives who have lost loved ones to senseless gun violence." Her letter linked Michael to those of the children in Sandy Hook, Aurora shootings, and by extension, period, school shootings, senseless violence at the hands of guns. In late November 2014, Ferguson Nation once again, grand jury declined to indict Officer Wilson. Days later, in early December, similar grand jury declined to indict Officer Daniel Pentello after he was reported on video choking Eric Gardner outside of his Staten store. This resulted in more protests calling for police accountability, cameras, and police. In April 2015, Baltimore erupted in violence and protests after Freddie Gray died agonizing and violent death while in his custody. With the help of an aggressive prosecutor, police arrested. Yes? Oh. I don't know. Is it? No, I think this is the conference call. Well, this is a. Is that any better? Just stay there. Is that a little bit better? Okay. So where was I? I apologize for that. So the similar grand jury declined to indict Officer Daniel Patillo after he was recorded on video choking Eric Garner outside of his Staten Island store. This resulted in more protests calling for accountability, body cameras, and better community policing. In April 2015, Baltimore erupted in violence and protest after Freddie Gray died an agonizing and violent death while in police custody. With the help of an aggressive prosecutor, the police were arrested. Protests, marches, and reactions were organized around the country, and the Black Lives Matter movement helped to focus national conversation on police violence. In 2015, Dylan Roof, in a racist, hate-filled rage, strategically stalked parishioners in a prayer meeting at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church in South Carolina. He was shot and killed. He shot and killed 9 people. Last month, Chris Mercer killed 13 people and wounded 20 when he violently attacked a small community college in Roseburg, Oregon. And just last week, ISIS terrorists attacked Paris in a coordinated effort with bombs, guns, and suicide bombers throughout the city. As anthropologists, we are called to make connections, to understand how power and violence connect and motivate people towards either peace or violence, or sometimes both. We have the power and the obligation to explain and narrate culture, and it seems that the global culture we inhabit is a culture of violence. From Syria to Ferguson, from Cairo to Charleston, violence, pain, hate, frustration, inequality, and rancid racism seem to be common themes. In the media-saturated society where body cameras, smartphones, GoPros, and satellite trucks seem to record everything, and experts on Twitter, CNN, and even the American Anthropological Association seek to explain the violence in our world, the connection between war, terrorism, and police and gun violence are sorely missing. However, the frustration, precarity, and both hope and hopelessness can be mapped onto specific factors that can include the loss of support by the state, volatility, complexity, uncertainty, and violence and threats of violence, marginalization, and systemic injustice. It is not easy, but it is incumbent upon us to explain clearly and intimately to our students and various audiences the impact violence, marginalization, and injustice have on people, society, and culture. At the same time, however, we have to be mindful of some of the positive strides taken to build a safer, more just society. We have to keep it balanced. And I think it is important with all the violence we've seen to recognize that actually gun violence is down by about half since 1993. Things like drunk driving deaths are down. Fewer people are killed in wars just because there's many wars, but not as many people are getting killed. Hunger and is down. And there's a lot of other sort of positive things, but it's just difficult when we're saturated with all the violence that we feel like we have an obligation to explain. So I just wanted, that was the sort of the point I was trying to make. There's a lot of violence in the world, and we have an obligation to help contextualize it and explain it. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Shalini for organizing this panel. Excuse me, I get my water. I know that Shalini's been hard at work. She actually sent out an email telling us how much time we had. I saw 10 minutes. You said 5 to 10 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go 10. All right, I'm going to go 10. I've actually organized my 10 minutes into sort of 3 different sections. One is talking about Ferguson, the context of Ferguson. One is talking about the movement and the moment that Ferguson represents. And I'll finish with what anthropology can do. So in terms of context, Eric Holder referred to Ferguson as ground zero for civil rights for this generation. We saw protests, we saw freedom rides, we saw networking that came out of the activities related to Ferguson, and the further development of the Black Lives Matter movement and organization. And at the same time, we saw responses by the state to the quelling of dissent and very militarized responses. So what happened in Ferguson was very specific and unique at the same time, but it also has a lot of the same elements that were reflected across the country. So Ferguson, in my mind, sort of brought the attention of structural racism, the structural nature of race and racism to the fore. So it's actually an interesting test case for the sort of lived and material experiences of structural racism or systematic disadvantages tied to race. So in the Department of Justice's Ferguson report, it noted arrests and police harassment leading to disproportionate contact of blacks with the criminal justice system, leading to the loss of income, jobs, and at times death in the case of Mike Brown. And we see the structural aspects of Ferguson as we see that 20% of Ferguson's budget came from fines and court appearances, basically on the backs of its black residents. So essentially these residents were caught in the system by not being able to pay fines, being subject to arrests, police harassment, and as I said earlier, this represented a decrease or lack of access to income, jobs, and at times death. So it's essentially what happened is a double or a triple tax on blackness. But in Ferguson, we see policy, practice, and race coming together to create and reproduce disadvantage, as well as these militarized responses by the state to quell dissent. So in the post-Ferguson moment, we see that the Black Lives Matter movement has facilitated a moment, and the moment has facilitated a movement. This has created a broader context to address race and racism, changing notions of blackness along with responses to racism, as well as policy interventions. So the foregrounding of queer, trans, and gay people and women in social movements feels quite new and quite unique to this particular moment. Excuse me. The critique of normative versions of blackness and leadership, the critique of respectability politics, and alliances around system change are all sort of in the ether in this moment and at this time. So in terms of alliances around system change, we see mass incarceration and the coming together of unlikely parties such as the Koch brothers and Van Jones. We see reform, criminal justice reform. For an example of this is President Obama's clemency of 40 plus prisoners. Well, this isn't enough, and this lift all boats kind of policy intervention is emblematic of his administration. The critique, or the moment of critique, or the context of critique is even stronger in this particular moment. So this sort of pushback against colorblind policies is a sort of result of, I think, the atmosphere and the context that Ferguson has created. And of course, we have campus activism, so most recently in the University of, at the University of Missouri. But we also see a more deliberate focus on race and racism across sectors. Right? So we see a cross-sector embrace of many of the tenets of Black Lives Matter. So we see human rights groups that, such as Amnesty International, attending to grassroots activism. The same with the legal field through the Center for Constitutional Justice, providing infrastructure and legal support. And we see the two main political parties and the presidential nominees or would-be nominees embracing and not embracing at different points the notion of Black Lives Matter. So the place of politics and political discourse is much more apparent at this point. Interestingly, we also see philanthropy and foundations engagement with sort of grassroots activism and some notions that are forwarded by Black Lives Matter. And it's interesting because a lot of the money and interest has been steered towards racial justice in more deliberate ways, but the funding the funding now is not as much based on metrics or defined outcomes, but is much more fluid and open, which is a switch or a change for philanthropy. And the role that philanthropy plays is problematic in a lot of ways for a lot of the participants, so that's a broader question that we can talk about later if you like. So the question is, what can anthropology do? And I preface all this by saying, when asked and when appropriate, we can do a lot. One, I think, obviously, our skills around ethnographic documentation of the movement and the moment are extremely valuable. To bear witness to what is happening is an extremely valuable pursuit. We have the tools and the know-how to do. And regardless of what happens in terms of outcomes through this movement or from this time, what's transpiring requires documentation. Now, having said that, we don't have to record everything. Right? And these are issues around ethics, privacy, and surveillance. So we have to be very deliberate and focused in regards to how we use our methodology and our tools. But given anthropology's knowledge around social movements, race and identity formation, organizational structure, we can offer advice and sometimes technical assistance if asked. We can also help facilitate cross-generational alliances, and elders can offer insights into the successes and the challenges of past movements, but a lot of times elders don't want to be called elders, so we should also think about language. So having said that, anthropology has any number of methodological as well as analytical tools. We have the ability to build networks, both nationally and internationally, and the ability to transfer our skills to a broad set of audiences through public and applied anthropology. So on that note, I'd like to challenge anthropology and anthropologists to engage in the movement, but to do so in a responsible way, with all this sort of ethical and moral awareness that we can muster up as we move forward in this very important moment. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. No, afternoon, although it would be evening on my time cycle, but good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Shalini for putting this together and for her work as the head of the Committee on Minority Affairs Issues. Okay, and she's really done a lot of work to try to make that committee actually work, and so we'd like to thank her for that. So what I'll do is I will briefly sketch some topics that I think we can discuss that contextualize some of what we are confronting now. So I'm going to talk first about the concept of new racial projects, and then I'm going to talk a bit about social movements, and then from there, the role of anthropology. So I think we could all agree that the events in Ferguson and other sites of state-sponsored violence and the aftermath represent a visible culmination of new racial projects that are, in fact, hemispheric, if not worldwide. So in trying to get a theoretical handle on this, I find that Omi and Winon's concept of racial project is useful to think with. So they define racial project as one, as quote, simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial dynamics and an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. So I think what's interesting about this is that we can identify racial projects that are created to distribute resources more equitably, as well as those that are designed to produce and reproduce inequality. In the US, in the 60s and 70s, and in the 90s in South Africa and in some Central and Latin American countries, racial projects to redistribute resources more equitably, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid struggle, and the movements that brought about constitutional recognition in Central and Latin America, resulted in significant potential for progress. The response was the emergence of a new racial project characterized by new forms of racism and new interpretations of inequality. In Central and Latin American countries, the ideology of multiculturalism often serves to disguise the appropriation of land and resources. In the US, abolition was met with Jim Crow segregation, and currently the next racial project is massive incarceration and state-sponsored violence. And this has become the core of a new racial project to turn back previously obtained rights and to reinforce dispossession of resources and of life itself. In the US and South Africa, the hegemonic explanations of these new racial dynamics revolve around the ideology of post-racialism, that racism no longer exists, so failure to thrive is a consequence of individual or group culture. However, racial projects are always contested, and there has been a resurgence of new social movements and popular protest. In the US, the carceral state and the impunity of state-sponsored violence has been the site of a new movement, in addition to long-standing organizations, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement that has drawn tens of thousands of young people into activism. We see all over the country that the student movements are gaining traction. This actually feels like my generation, the 70s, where you have student movements and all kinds of things happening. So there's a new wave of global activism. The Occupy movement in the US actually spread to several countries, and popular protests and huge demonstrations in both Latin America and Europe have resulted in the election of governments oriented towards defying the New World Order with respect to debt and distribution of resources, although obviously they confront serious challenges. Though the movements differ significantly, these movements have some common features that I think are worthy of note. First, they have international ties or are international in scope. So I think we've all heard about the Black Lives Movement, communication with the Palestinian youth about how to deal with tear gas, etc. The Afro-Colombians, for example, have relations with African Americans. So there's a great deal of international communication and support. Many of these movements rely on the human rights framework and the use of international covenants. And this has advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it's possible to bring this to bear. And Michael Brown's parents, I think, testified before one of the UN bodies, and that body issued a scathing report about police brutality, the death penalty, and incarceration in the US. But always these covenants must be enforced locally. Digital technology is an integral element, and I think we'll hear more about that. And it's been of tremendous assistance in the globalization of protest. However, it can also be used by other forces to constrain protest. Another issue with respect to digital technology is whether it becomes the movement itself or whether it functions as a tool of the movement. And this is something that is being worked out in various places. Most of the new movements in most of them we see an emphasis on culture and the use of culture for mobilization and for general support. In many movements, there's an active discussion about patriarchal forms of organization. Women leaders are at the forefront, and gender and sexuality are being renegotiated. And I don't have any downside to that one. So despite the rising inequality and racism, there are important spaces and fissures that we should take note of. As Pam Buck, who is here, I always quote her, tells us, quote, "More people than ever are questioning the hegemonic ideology." And a recent poll of of Americans found that 60% of Americans now feel that the police treat blacks differently. And this is just a few months after a poll that much of the majority of the white population thought there was no more racism. So there's a bit of a shift there. The other thing that's happening, whiteness no longer has the same value. If you've been reading the papers, there's some interesting articles in there. The life expectancy of a cohort of white men is declining for the first time ever, largely due to suicide and drug use and drug abuse. We also find that heroin use has skyrocketed among whites, leading to a new conversation about drug abuse. So once it's among whites, we're beginning to get a new conversation. As a matter of fact, the headline said that people are talking about a gentler war on drugs, which is interesting, since the war on drugs has been a war on people of color. So it remains to be seen where this will lead. However, these are openings that we should take note of. What can we do as anthropologists? With respect to the discipline, we now have more racialized anthropologists in the discipline, but I would suggest that in many areas and universities and other places of work, the focus on diversity rather than on anti-racism has assisted the ideology of post-racialism. Anthropologists of color continue to face discrimination in many areas, as we know from recent reports and articles. Teaching is an important thing that many of us do. And in a post-racial era, teaching about race is particularly challenging. And so as we teach, we must be willing to confront race and racism even when it produces hostility among the students. And it certainly does in many cases. And there's one case of a young African-American woman. The students went to the dean and she was reprimanded, but I think Facebook helped straighten that out. But it's difficult, but it's something we have to do. And I would suggest that a useful tactic in trying to do this is historicizing racialization and white privilege. I think that helps people to understand how things come about as a result of social conditions. Scholarship. As always, it's necessary to address the problematic appropriation of culture, which always happens, to understand race as a social relationship, and to identify racism in all its manifestations. It's important to develop and support new areas of research, which we are doing, such as policing and incarceration. And as Raymond said, I think it's clear that the tools of anthropology can be well applied to understanding new racial projects, and in fact, trying to look ahead to see what the next new racial project is. We can analyze issues such as, what are the social forces? What is the context? What can a comparative approach tell us about racial projects and the effectiveness of social movements? So I think it's critical also to intervene in the hegemonic ideology, but we also have to find ways to get our work into the public sphere. We should stop talking to each other. Well, we can continue to talk to each other, but we should also try to talk to other people. And finally, for engaged anthropologists, this moment also represents a tremendous opportunity to link our research to social movements and to collaborate with activists in seeking social justice. Thank you.
So I'll be brief and hopefully mostly coherent. So what I'd like to do is, maybe overly provocatively, reframe, at least for me, the question at the center of this panel, at least the question as I see it. And the question for me really ultimately is, kind of, do Black lives matter to anthropology? And I'll admit to you, there are moments when I'm able to answer that question, I think, in the positive, and other moments when I feel like I can't make a strong case. There are a couple ways in which I try to parse that, so I'll be very quick. We'll see if it makes sense. The first is what I consider to be these ongoing conversations about the very role of politics or the political within the field of anthropology. So there is this sense, and some of it's generational, though I don't think it's only that there was this moment before the discipline was so hyper-politicized. We can just study the Kula ring for the sake of knowing, right? This idea that there was a way to step outside of the political fray and just know what the other is doing without any political implications, without any particular political axe to grind, and this sense that one of the things some versions of the current anthropological project seem to be producing are students with a much more political project, an investment in the inextricable relationship between politics and research. Some would say in a post-Foucauldian moment or something. But I think that's a question for the field, and we don't answer it all in the same way. Some of that discrepancy also speaks to the various ways in which we understand the significance of Black lives and Black deaths snuffed out by the state. So that's one way to think about it. The other thing is there's something so amazingly ambitious about the anthropological project. I think that's why we're all here. I often tell students that it's this wonderful combination of incredible hubris and humility at the same time. And so the hubris, of course, is the fact that we can imagine, as anthropologists, card-carrying members of this guild, that we can speak across the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. We're in every room, right? All of these folks are interlocutors. Even physicists don't imagine necessarily they can have that kind of reach. There's something very, ambitious about that. At the very same time, fundamentally, I think, what grounds our methodology is this idea. It doesn't matter who the person is, but if you listen closely enough to them, if you take seriously what their story is, you will learn something profound about them, about their world, and about the human condition. Most people don't have the time to, quote unquote, suffer fools, as my mom and grandma would have said. In some ways, that's what we do. Partly because we want to figure out how people get to where they are, why they believe what they believe, but also because we recognize everyone is an incredibly powerful ambassador for their cultural universe. And so one of the ways in which I describe my project as an anthropologist is say I'm interested in listening to Black people theorize themselves, their relationships to other folks, and their relationships to the state. And to do that in a way that really takes seriously the fact that we don't corner the market on sophisticated theoretical frameworks for how we understand the state of the current situation in the world. And so that for me is really important. Another way to think about why anthropology should be at the forefront of these discussions, because we should already be listening. We should already know before it happens that it's about to happen, and why, what the arguments are, what the claims are being made about how they're related to how folks in precarious situations understand that precarity and try to find ways to carve out protective space when they know marginalization can always get worse. Exploitation can always get worse. The other thing, and Leith did, I think, a wonderful job of framing this for us, is there's a way in which Black lives, also in anthropological context, can seem to matter somewhat less if these are Black lives that are kind of parochialized as simply bound within a particular nation state, especially if it's the US, right? Because we always have this notion, this fantasy of the field being way out there somewhere. And so other people do the work here in the US. And so it's recognizing that one of the things we can do particularly well is, I think, is always transnationalize and globalize any particular problem. Any social phenomenon is always a global phenomenon as much as a local one. And so how do anthropologists help us to understand that and thematize that for the rest of the world compellingly? I think that's really key. The other thing is the role of the media. And we know there's so much about the current movement that sort of is organized around the power and potential of social media. We're in a social media moment. And one of the things I always remind myself is we've been trained, in a sense, to be complicit in our own surveillance. That at every moment, at every turn, we're constantly putting more and more of our business in the street, as they say. In a flash, in an instant, halfway around the world. What does that mean? What kind of species is that producing? What kind of expectations about privacy and publicness is that reconfiguring? And at the same time, we know, even if we have the images, right? So the difference we know between Michael Brown and Eric Gardner says we have a smoking gun in one instance. We have it caught on camera. Even in that moment, we recognize what someone like Gertz would have called the thinness of the visual image, right? That it doesn't seem to give us the kind of evidentiary grounding we think it should give us to make claims, adjudicative claims, on the legal state for how they respond to the death of Black bodies. And so thinking about the role the media can and cannot play is going to be really important, right? Not necessarily demonizing and dismissing and disavowing it, but recognizing it can do, it's in some ways incredibly open platform and process, and that it can be deployed to various and sometimes discrepant kind of ends, and we need to think about the ways in which we are complicit in particular versions of what the social media landscape can do to either produce in a constructive way or potentially destroy the possibility of newly imagined forms of social community. I think that's really key. The last point I'll make is one of the traps I feel like we've fallen into is, and I talk about this a little bit too much too, is this idea that we know we have a really good argument about race being a social construction, and we've basically, I think, won that in the public sphere. In some ways, I would also say that Black death, high Black mortality rates are also a social construction. The question is, how is it constructed in and through sociality? What are the ways in which we produce those things? And they're both equally real in that sense. And so part of, I think, what I want to imagine is, as a discipline, one of the things we have to start doing is fundamentally revisiting our basic claims about what we're doing in the academy, what we're saying about the world, how we're doing it, and why we think we matter as a field. Because to not get that right, I think it's to recognize that not only will we be irrelevant, but we're not going to be able to have a way of talking about all the things that are going to be so important to challenge, to deconstruct, to reimagine in a 21st century that actually needs some real, serious, rigorous anthropology, I would argue. So thanks.
First, thank you, Shalini, for inviting me to participate in this roundtable alongside this esteemed group of scholars. I'll pick up on some of the themes that they've introduced while also trying to identify some other lines of inquiry. Thanks also for allowing me to share my time with Jarimar Bonilla, with whom I've been recently thinking and writing about issues of race, representation, and social action. As we survey the contemporary terrain of U.S. racial protests in the face of inequalities across a range of institutional settings, including housing, policing, education, health, employment, and political representation, we are presented with a fraught set of circumstances that at once highlight some inspiring possibilities on the one hand and the perpetuation of disparity, even if in reconfigured forms, on the other. Students of color and their allies in institutions of higher education across the nation, galvanized by the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and similar racial justice efforts, are boldly confronting administrative hypocrisy and demanding concrete actions to address long-standing structural inequalities that legitimate everyday racism on their respective campuses. These students' efforts are a reflection of the powerful, cumulative, and in many ways unanticipated effects of the hybrid forms of digital and analog protests that Jarimar will discuss in a few minutes. Protesters have also disrupted various presidential campaign events, eschewing politics of respectability, and demanding the candidates develop comprehensive racial justice platforms. These candidates have stumbled publicly while seeking to signal their comprehension of and solidarity with racial justice efforts. But what is the relationship between the discursive legitimacy crisis that prompts a shift from all lives matter to Black Lives Matter, and broader political, economic, and racial legitimacy crises that would require the dismantling and reconstitution of our criminal justice system, as well as the other aforementioned institutions? We seem to rely on an optical logic that presumes upon the existence of a shared viewpoint from which we can clearly see the need for comprehensive change. But it seems that no matter how many dash cam, body cam, and cell phone videos capture images of racialized police violence, there is an uncanny capacity within the mainstream public imagination to view these situations as singular events or momentary aberrations, rather than as the logical outcome of a system that was created to maintain the hegemonic status of whiteness within a racialized social order. Perhaps the visibility of contemporary racial protests is an attempt to create a new optical order, a new way of seeing race and structural inequality. Thus, we might build from Black Lives Matter to reconsider how the bodily materiality of racialized populations comes to be seen. Among our anthropological colleagues who are suddenly preoccupied with questions of materiality, ontology, and different statuses of being, it is curious that race is almost completely absent from their discussions. For those of us who study race and racialization, however, we have always had to grapple with the question of what, or more specifically, who counts as a being, and what practices those beings are endowed with the capacity to enact. Tomorrow marks 1 year since the killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice by Cleveland police officers. For these officers, race materialized this unarmed child's body as a threat in need of a lethal response. Whether it is Rice or an African-American child sitting in her desk at school, leaving a pool party, or walking home from the store with Skittles and iced tea, racism rematerializes bodies and linked entities, transforming their ontologies. Slight children become threatening adults. Cell phones, candy, and sidewalks become weapons. Leisurely bodily comportment becomes terrifying. deference becomes disrespect. In this context, the affirmation that Black Lives Matter creates new possibilities for rematerializing the body in the context of long-standing histories of racist ontologies. Finally, the framing of this roundtable, Ferguson and beyond, asks us to think about the broader spatial and temporal connections we might draw between events of racial violence that take place across differing contexts. Indeed, what come to be viewed as emergent there and now forms of racial violence and injustice from some scholarly and popular perspectives are, for many, the way that things have always been here. Thus, a call to think about Ferguson and beyond might allow us to connect new historical, political, economic, and ethno-racial dots. However, we should be careful about what we mean by moving beyond Ferguson, much less this effort, like moving beyond the black-white binary, becomes a way of erasing the very inequalities we seek to understand and address. As anthropologists, we must continue to attend to the profoundly local ways in which inequality and violence are experienced in people's everyday lives. Our analyses must not treat communities like Ferguson as mere placeholders, metaphors, or exemplars, but rather as concrete contexts with their own histories in which people have been making their everyday lives, grappling with the inequalities they face, and creatively enacting the kinds of alternative realities that we hope to understand and document as anthropologists interested in contributing to the creation of a more just otherwise. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I am going to be very brief. I hope. I just want to make really 4 points and a conclusion. My comments are based on reflections about the kind of afterlife of the article that Jonathan Rosa and I wrote about #Ferguson, which was something that the editor of AE, Angelique Hagood, she approached me about doing this, and I think it's important to recognize that AE did take that initiative and make a space for this article that came out very quickly after the Ferguson events. And the article has been picked up and circulated. It has been read by a fair number of people, and I've noticed that, interestingly, there have been 2 different audiences for the article. So some people have imagined it as an article about digital activism, and other folks have imagined it as an article about race. And my comments today are to push us to think about how it has to be necessarily about both simultaneously. So my first point is that I think we need to think about how and why certain populations are engaging in digital activism more than others. That is, I argue that the choice to engage in digital activism is already a racialized choice. We know already that a disproportionate number of people of color are on platforms like Twitter, and I don't think that we can think of Twitter as a public sphere without thinking about it as a Black public sphere. And the existence of this kind of Black commons, I think, is related to the fact of the whiteness of other commons and the fact that certain populations feel completely shut out of these other spaces. So we know that for example, traditional media, op-eds, all these platforms tend to replicate white and white male voices disproportionately. So it is not coincidental that folks that feel misrepresented, maligned, or silenced in these spaces would then take more readily and more quickly to these alternative platforms. So part of what I would say to those who are interested in thinking about Twitter as a new kind of commons is that they have to pay attention to issues of race and to the racialized presence of people on Twitter and on digital media more generally, and in thinking about that as a kind of community. My second point is that a lot of folks, one hears, especially from folks of a particular generation, a lot of despairing comments about digital activism and the idea that #activism or digital activism is not enough, that physical presence is necessary, that it's important to mobilize, and there is a lot of minimizing that is done of these kinds of mobilizations. But I think, again, it's important to take into account who turns to Twitter and why, and how it might be folks whose physical activism, embodied activism, might be overly criminalized and might be subject to increased violence and repression. And so to think then about digital activism not as a lazy space, but as a kind of safe space for populations that have few safe spaces, and who many kinds of physical gatherings might be constituted as riots, as violent protests, for even just raising your voice, right? So there's a kind of affect that can be expressed through Twitter that in embodied and in person reactions and engagements might not be possible. So I think in thinking about Twitter, you know, a lot of folks have actually thought about the problems of, for example, trolls on Twitter and how Twitter is not a safe space. But it's important to think about why, for some people, dealing with trolls might be safer, easier than engaging in activism on the streets and or in a kind of real way. So I put real very much in quotations. So I think we need to think more carefully about that. Oh, my third point is that when thinking about Twitter and digital activism, there's also this idea that it's a very ephemeral practice that doesn't have long-lasting effects. I want to push back on that in two senses. So the first one is that and we make this point in the article, is that we need to understand how digital activism, like all activism, its impact has to be thought about in a cumulative fashion. So rather than looking at just one episode, one event, one kind of moment in which people are tweeting or galvanizing, or even, this is also true for other forms of social movement. I've written about labor strikes and other kinds of actions. It's difficult to say when a movement has succeeded or failed. And so, for example, the mobilizations that happened around Trayvon Martin, for example, one could think that those mobilizations failed because his killer was not brought to justice. But it activated people in a particular way. It created different kinds of consciousness, and it set the terrain for later mobilizations that happened under Ferguson, under Eric Gardner, and that will sadly continue to happen, we can probably predict. So I think that in part pushes against this idea of digital activism in Twitter as a very ephemeral practice. But the other aspect that I want to think about is also how Twitter functions as a kind of archive, and particularly a counter-archive for populations, once again, who are misrepresented or silenced in the media. So I've noticed in just following folks on Twitter that I feel that one can see on Twitter what Trio described as the double-sided nature of historicity. So social movement actors' awareness of themselves as both actors and narrators of history. And we can see how people take to Twitter not just to mobilize and to use it as a kind of tool, but also to document their practices, because they know that they're not being documented in other places. They know that they're not getting kind of media attention that is important in the present, but is also important for creating a historical archive that could then help tell those stories in the future and count those as important contributions to Black history and American history as well. So, and I think that we need to think about that also in relationship to some arguments that are made that I think are important to reckon with about the trauma that may result from the repetitive viewing of images, the repetitive tweeting and retweeting of violent encounters with the police, et cetera. It's true that we need to think carefully about the psychological consequences of that, but at the same time, we have to think about how that fits in within a kind of Black radical tradition of an archival practice that does seek to preserve these stories that might otherwise not be believed, not be documented, not be taken seriously, and lack of that kind of proof might not have a lasting imprint. Now, though the fourth, so the last point I want to make is also about how Twitter might also, in terms of this double-sided nature of historicity, might also be a space in which certain populations can become more empowered. So I noticed in the video that circulated of the South Carolina student where the police officer came into the classroom and tossed her across the room, if you guys noticed, the cameras started rolling significantly before he tossed her across the room. So the students who documented this, they didn't turn on their cameras when violence happened. They turned on their cameras because they expected violence to happen. And so I think that tells us, again, about this archival practice, about this documenting that is happening, but also how these technologies are empowering people to do something about it, to speak up. And so a lot of folks talked about the passivity of the other students in the room, but I think we also need to think about the active engagement of those who did decide to film, and there were at least 2 that decided to film in that moment. So I think in looking at digital activism and social media, we need to think about how certain populations are engaging in Twitter in particular ways, and some of the arguments that are made about Twitter being ephemeral, about Twitter not being a safe commons because of the trolls, et cetera, about it not having a kind of lasting impact need to be rethought in relationship to the kinds of populations that are on Twitter. And so my conclusion is basically that in thinking about digital activism and Twitter, we can't think, digital activism and race, we can't think about these as separate issues. And in fact, we cannot theorize digital activism without theorizing race. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists so much for both accepting my invitation to be on this panel and delivering such amazing, powerful thoughts on this topic. If we could put Lee back up on the monitor, maybe we could either have, if anyone wants to respond to anything that has been said, this would be a time to just kind of do that for a few minutes, and then perhaps since we have so many people here who are clearly engaged, we can open it up for questions at the mic. But first, can I ask, would anyone like to respond to anything that's been said or add anything?
Can you talk to each other?
Yeah, you can talk to each other.
I'm curious about, I'm sorry, what's your name again? Yeti Mad. I'm curious about sort of Twitter and its popularity because there's a lot of sort of discussion around Twitter's dying. Twitter's becoming less popular. It's on the decline or demise. I'm wondering, is that the case? And if so, how do you think that'll impact activism? And will it move to a new platform? Is there something unique about Twitter as a platform that can't be replicated on other social media, through other social media outlets?
Yeah, well, I think definitely Twitter has a lot of, oh, I'm sorry, don't yell at me. Hello, okay. Yeah, so definitely there's a lot of particularities about Twitter that distinguish it even from Facebook, for example, Facebook's use of algorithms and all this stuff. And there are certain things that have made it more conducive to activist use. However, what I always tell my students is to not overhype these technologies and not talk about in the moment of Tahrir Square, people were talking about the Facebook revolution. So with Ferguson, it's been about the Twitter revolution. But I remind them that every technology is going to be used by social movements. So the transistor radio was revolutionary, the photocopying machine for making flyers, right? So I think it's possible that Twitter is either its use is declining or its use is changing, but I'm confident that political actors will find other tools, if that is so, to engage with. So to me, that it doesn't concern me in that sense. I do think it's still being used and being transformed, and there's so many creative uses that people do. For example, a lot of people talk about the limits of the characters, but there's, the 144 characters. But people do Twitter essays where they, do these kind of long things with multiple tweets. They find creative ways of tweeting images that have text in them. So I think that as long as, folks are politicized and have creative capacities, they will, continue to use the technologies that are available to them for that. Yeah.
Interesting. That sort of speaks to Leith's point about what do you say? Does the medium become the movement? Sorry. So that speaks to Leith's. You had a question in your discussion around if the social media will become the movement, and you're sort of saying it's not. It's transformative. It doesn't necessarily relate to the medium only, but it will be used in other mediums as well.
Well, I just think that all social movements have engaged with forms of media. I mean, and we can connect this back to Emmett Till being featured on Jet Magazine. You know, that can be directly thought of in relationship to the cell phone videos and all of that. So to me, it's not the technology that's creating political possibilities, but political actors using the technologies that are available at the time. And that's why my point is more that folks that are interested in theorizing digital activism and thinking about technologies have to take into account the racialized experiences of the populations engaging with them. And this was a point in the article with Jonathan Rosa. We also talked about how the use of Twitter is not a disembodied use. People are still in their racialized bodies, and those experiences are being, are very much part of their use of the platforms. And some folks have talked about how, in terms of the trolls, I might have made light of that because some folks have talked about how if your picture of your Twitter handle, if you are Black, and especially Black women, get trolled way more. But I think that has to be understood in the kind of aggressions that Black women face off of Twitter as well. So I don't know if they feel more exposed on digital media than in daily life, or if it's related to their disproportionate exposure.
Thanks.
Comment on anything? Should we open it up to the floor? Okay, so I would invite anyone who would like to pose any questions to our panelists or have any related comments to please use the mic. I think it's probably going to get turned on. Thank you.
I am. Is it on? Okay. All
I'm
right.
sorry, can I ask you to also please state your name
Sure.
before you speak? Thank you.
So really quickly, my question was actually for Dr. Baker. Is he?
State your name, please.
Okay. My name is April Harrison. I have a question for Dr. Baker. Is he online currently?
Yes.
Okay. Hello. Hi, Dr. Baker. My name's April Harrison. I'm a Duke alumna, and I just read the Department of Cultural Anthropology's open letter of love to Black students. So I was wondering if you had any ideas, or if any of the other panelists had any ideas on how digital spaces like Twitter could be used to bridge the divide between faculty of color and students of color in addressing these social injustices on campus.
I did not repeat the question.
Yes. I'll go a little slower, sorry.
Can you hear her at all, Lee? Or do you want
No.
us to repeat?
I can't really hear that well.
Maybe
Is
you
this
can
better?
type it in the chat.
Okay.
Okay. Should I go up there?
I can repeat your question if you do it in parts.
Okay. Regarding the open letter of love to Black students, is there a way that digital spaces could bridge the divide between faculty of color and students of color at places like
Regarding
Duke?
your open letter that you published, Lee, she wants to know if there are ways to bridge the divide between faculty and students of color. Is that right?
Yes, thanks. Well, using digital spaces specifically.
Using digital spaces specifically.
Yes, I think there is a real important role, and it's with both digital spaces as well as analog spaces. I think the key is for people to sort of listen and understand relationships. And I assume she's talking about administrators and faculty and students on college campuses. Yes. And really understanding the real relationship, and I think part of a racialized moment in history where free speech and ideas of free speech are actually pitted against sort of systematically ideas of racial and words of racial oppression. And this dichotomy is like a classic American conundrum where two goods get pitted. It's kind of like colorblind or something. It's sort of like, it's one of these moments in time when two very important aspects of America come and collide where Black people and people of color end up losing because they cannot demand that speech that hurts, speech that ridicules, speech that is racist is somehow not free speech. And it's a real difficult conundrum, but for the administrators to understand that not all free speech is free is one thing. On the other hand, students have to understand that there are limitations in terms, particularly in universities, that have to embrace the wide spectrum of political ideologies. That said, I think having conversations, using digital space, really trying to populate these anonymous yik-yak sort of anonymous messaging sites with positive just vibes and positive words, I think would go a long way as well. And I think that's kind of some of my thoughts, but listening to each other in honest and robust engagement where the faculty, the administrators, and students have equal voices in the process.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Hillary Dick. So thank you to all the panelists. That was really wonderful, stimulating set of comments, very inspirational. I guess I have a question, but I also had a reflection. I really appreciated the many connections that were drawn to both violence and oppression and marginalization in other contexts beyond the United States, and how they're not only parallels, but also processes that people are experiencing in similar ways, although sometimes to different effects. I think there are powerful political, economic, and global connections that are driving those, and that got me thinking to another, especially thinking about the relationships between kind of social movements and similarities between the US and Latin America. Another piece of that, of course, is and then not just in that region, but the massive movements of human beings across the globe right now, refugees, migrants, and the ways that they confront incredible violence in their, I'm gonna get emotional, in their efforts to find safety and a better life. And there are also the processes of mass incarceration and the privatization of the incarceration system here in the United States have a parallel story in terms of immigration detention centers and so forth. So, and we can see now also, obviously, how refugees coming out of Northern Africa and Syria are being treated and responded to in devastating ways. So I just wanted to add that as one of the other sort of stories and processes that's happening. And I was thinking also in terms of thinking about the Black Lives Movement here in the United States, I was thinking about the Dreamers movement, right? So the undocumented children who are trying to fight for a pathway to citizenship here in the United States. I don't know. Have there been links between those groups at all? Maybe the panelists don't know either, but I was curious to know if there are connections between the Black Lives movement and the Dreamers movement. Thank you.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about migration, and then maybe we can talk about Dreamers and Black Lives Matter and interconnections between them. One of the things that's been most fascinating about looking at the migration situation in Europe is the profound inability to articulate that situation in relation to race because of the ways in which particular European nations imagine themselves to not be grappling with race issues. Race is a US issue. That's not something that Europe deals with, regardless of whether it created it, right? So it's interesting, even in the context of the recent terrorist acts in France or the recent violence in France, that again, that's framed as an issue around migration, even though the people who perpetrated those acts were largely born in France. So it's not framed as a domestic issue of racialization, it's framed as a matter of migration, and so we need to manage these migrant bodies in very particular ways, rather than managing the policies, the domestic policies that marginalize, racialize, and position people in ways that, in fact, contribute to the forms of violence that then these nations wonder about how they came to be. In terms of the relationship between Black Lives Matter and the Dreamers, it's really tricky, and I don't know how fair this is. One of the most inspiring things about Black Lives Matter to me has been, again, the rejection of a respectability politics, particularly because of the queer women of color who have been at the forefront of that movement, for whom respectability has never worked. And I worry deeply about the Dreamer movement and the respectability that it invokes, right? So the Dreamer movement is, we're not the ones who did the bad thing, our parents did. We're aspiring to embrace the American dream that has never really existed. And so I worry about the ways that the Dreamer movement reproduces the very forms of inequality that it purports to overcome or attempts to overcome.
All right, thanks. My name is Jaron Benjamin. I'm a community organizer by trade. I remember when I have a question, but I want to preface it first. When I was being trained as an organizer, and my first experience with racialized violence as an organizer was out in Jena, Louisiana. And really the thing that I learned there was that the goal of an organizer is to come in, organize folks, but you want to make some sort of political change and then try to enforce that change. And I remember last year, after Michael Brown was killed, I went to Ferguson, spent a week there, and it was really an amazing experience and very frightening from day one. And I really, really clung to that idea that, all right, between running from tear gas, running from police officers, running from not knowing where you're going to sleep when you get there, all this other stuff, really holding almost religiously to this idea that you need to, when you're talking to people on the doors and you're registering people to vote, when you're getting stories from people on the street, that it's all going to go into this policy change. You're going to implement the policy change, and then you're going to, that's how you're going to save yourself. But I remember afterwards talking to somebody, being documented, as there was a documentarian who was getting organizer stories on paper. And I remember when it hit me that that's not enough, because I just had, there was a beautiful baby black girl who I'm the father of, and suddenly that just vanished, that I knew that that's not necessarily enough. And I think that as an organizer who hasn't always respected the Academy and what they have to offer, I then realized, you also have to change minds. And that's something that the Academy, specifically cultural and social anthropology, is so great at. My question is, how do you do that? Because we sorely, on the people that are out there doing activism, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's in the physical space, how do you do that? How do you do that without being accused of aiding and abetting? Because both spaces are very politicized. Like, how do you do that and keep yourself safe? Because I think it's something that we very, very much need. But at the same time, people don't want to end their careers, and that's a real thing that we have to keep in mind. Thanks.
She wants to take it. So, does the question? Could you just repeat the question? How do you change minds around?
Without.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See me like non-objective. Yeah.
Okay. You go, Marco.
Well, I think in the Academy, it's not so much aiding and abetting, but you're accused of a lack of objectivity. And I think we have hopefully debunked that myth that there is some objectivity out there. We know that all of us have political views, and there are those who pretend to be able to separate themselves from those views when they do research. But I think we've spent a number of years speaking against that. Now, I think another thing to keep in mind is that what is important is how good your research is, not so much what side of the fence you're on. So you can have good researchers and bad researchers on both sides of a question. And, you know, I would argue that you can do better research by working with a social group, that you find out things that you wouldn't know if you were standing on the outside. And so I think, you know, it's a research, as a research method, it's very effective.
Sorry. I would just, I'd say that, academics or people that engage in academic pursuits maybe need to rethink their relationship to the academy. Are there other ways to be academics, intellectuals? Are there other ways to engage the subject matter that either straddle, that allow you to move between the sort of activists and more sort of traditionally academic spaces? So, I think it's, what you're asking is it presents an interesting opportunity and an interesting question to really help us think about what's our relationship to the academy and how do we communicate this subject matter, analytical, theoretical, to people that are engaged in the struggle on an everyday level, at the at the grassroots, grass tops. Because I think that there doesn't necessarily have to be that polarization. So I think it's probably on us to think about ways to address that polarization, to kind of diffuse it and develop some new channels, new relationships, new dynamics that sort of straddle or move out of the academy and move in. Now that's a challenge because there are sort of professional and career choices to be made, but they are choices to be made.
I wanted to say something quickly about that too. First, I thank you for coming. I really appreciate you being here, and I'm glad that this has become a space in which we can have a larger conversation. But I think what you're saying is real, that there is a significant risk involved, and there has been incidents of professors getting in trouble, losing their jobs over things that they have said in class or tweeted. So it's about what we do in the classroom, but we also have to think about what we do in the kind of public sphere as well. And so one thing, I think, there's a larger conversation that we can have about how we can aid and abet each other as activists and academics. And part of what we need is we need to defend tenure. We need to also combat against the precarity that is happening in the academy and the increased, we have now more adjuncts teaching than tenured faculty, and they don't have the same protections that tenured faculty have. So I think that tenured lives are also need to be defended, because we need to have the freedom to take risks in the classroom, because we could get fired over tweets, but we can also I've gotten evaluations, class evaluations, where my students have said that I have taken positions in relationship to the Iraq War, in relationship now to Black Lives Matter. I was told that a student said in that evaluation that I did not give a fair portrayal of Darren Wilson's side of the story in my discussion of Ferguson. Fortunately, it was countered by many other comments in the evaluations that students appreciated, the discussion of topics that we had in class, but we can't always count on those students filling in their evaluations, because sometimes the ones that are really riled up and angry are the ones that do that. So anyway, my kind of just a comment to your question is that I think we, as academics, we have to be aware of those risks and think carefully about how do we create safe spaces for ourselves as well. Yeah.
Shalini, okay, just because I haven't said anything yet, I'll say very briefly. I also think that one version of what's at stake is a question about objectivity, standards in the academy, assumptions, but I think it's also really about academics interrogating their own fears, right? So so even when it's, I think, a relatively low-risk situation, even tenured faculty with the protection of tenure is often terrified.
Yeah.
And we often don't know what we're terrified of or why. And I think so some of it's about us thinking really clearly about how and why we've internalized, I think often, so much fear. Yeah. And that translates into a version of cowardice that makes us unable to be good allies. And so I think thinking that through is really important too.
Maybe we can take a few questions.
Yeah, we can take a few more questions. I want to
Remind panelists to please say their name and also try to keep your questions brief so we can get through a few of them. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Diaz. I'm an assistant professor of Latino communications at Cal State Fullerton. And my question's kind of two parts specifically for John and Jonathan. John, I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the idea of revisiting the basic claims about our project and what are we doing as anthropologists, because I think, as you and many other people know, those people who do focus on issues of race, particularly in the US context, kind of end up on the outskirts of anthropological discussions. And so aside from having spaces like this, how do we go about reshaping or rethinking the anthropological project to include those things so that those of us doing that work aren't just deemed ethnic studies or American studies scholars and not relevant to anthro? And then as an extension of that, Jonathan, you mentioned how race is absent from analyses often. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the theoretical frameworks that you use in making very clear and deliberate space for race in your analyses, particularly in the case of Latinos and how race is questioned around issues of Latinidad. So, and thank you all for your amazing comments.
A few questions?
Yeah,
Can we take a few?
Or
and
we'll
then-
take a few questions and they'll respond at once. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Dave Crockett. I'm an associate professor of marketing, actually, at the University of South Carolina. So my broad question really is, every presentation actually made me think so much about suburbanization as a particular instantiation of the local. Throughout every one, Twitter activists, activists generally, the suburb is so often the space in which these things happen, and it seems to have very unique features. And I grew up in North St. Louis County, so I know Ferguson quite well. And there are some things that are unique about the cluster of small places that are right there, and how that structures the way the police relate and the way that taxes get collected and so forth. So I would love for you all to just say a few words about suburbanization and its role.
Hello, my name is Delvin Ellington. I'm actually a senior at the University of Missouri, and took part in the Concerned Student 1950 protest in living in the tents as a student. But now, coming off of that, I want to continue my pursuits in activism in that as an aspiring anthropologist and write about it, because I was the only person there that can possibly write about it as an ethnographic kind of way, but having these fears that have been kind of talked about like not being able to talk about it right, or whatever is talked about, where I might write might come up later in my academic career, because I plan on getting my master's and PhD and having that kind of follow me and see how that that kind of intersection that I'm at right now kind of follow me throughout the rest of my career.
Hi, everybody. Deborah Thomas, University of Pennsylvania. Two just really quick comment/provocations, I suppose, having to do with the knowledge project aspect of some of the things that you guys said. Jari, one of the things that struck me about how you talked about the safe space of of Black Twitter and digital activism, I think another important aspect of that is about where women participate in activism and how certain forms of activism are gendered spaces. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that if you are a single mom and you have two kids who are young and sleeping, you're not going to be out on the street. So I think it's a really another interesting dimension that needs to be brought into the discussions about activism. And Jessica Vinegar has a really nice piece in American Anthropologist a couple of years ago about what it meant to be a woman watching Tahrir Square, with Egyptian women who weren't there but were in their homes. And the other thing is just an aspect of what John said that I want to make sure doesn't get sort of swept under the rug, which has to do with the approach to what we do and the project of knowing, right, which has been an imperial project. And I think what's so important about what you said and what a number of us have been committed to, I think, is that this knowledge project has to be a relational knowledge project, and it cannot be about explaining what the natives do to the non-native, right? And I think that's how we develop stronger relationships with activists, with community organizers, with, you know, whoever the various stakeholders are that we want to attract. But that is an approach that needs to be reflected upon and adopted outside of this room and outside of the spaces with which we are engaged. And I feel that it's a transformation in the understanding of the production and generation of anthropological knowledge that's been called for again and again and again, but hasn't necessarily been truly understood and adopted. And I think it's important.
Okay, we'll take one final question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name's John Clark. I'm from the United Kingdom, so I need to confess that I am neither an anthropologist nor an American. So you can discount me if you wish. And I wanted to make two quick connections. One was to what I think of as the John Jackson paradox about race as a social construction. So I think you're right that we won that side of the argument, but missed the bit about social constructions kill people, that they are material and consequential, because social constructions sound so ephemeral and light and delicate. And the material bit is the hard bit now to win. The other was about the way Jonathan said, and I think he's right, that in Europe we are always astonished by the presence of race. It's nothing to do with us in any way whatsoever. And as I left the United Kingdom, the leader of the Labour Party, a man called Jeremy Corbyn, was being publicly trashed and humiliated for hesitating, and I mean it no stronger than that, hesitating over whether the military and the police, post-Paris, should adopt a shoot-to-kill policy. And Corbyn said, I'm not sure that a shoot-to-kill policy is the right thing to do. Since when the media and other political parties have nailed him as damaging the security of everybody. And amnesia plays a critical role in these moments, because everybody in that moment forgets that the people that we shoot to kill are always non-white. Right? We know who the enemy is, and they are black, Brazilian. They are just from elsewhere. Thank you very much, everybody. Great panel.
Lee, were you able to hear any of the questions? Yes?
Yes.
Here's my 10-second recap. The first one was about Latinos and Latinidad, directed at Jonathan. The second one was about suburbanization, why things keep happening in the suburbs. The third is about repercussions on writing. Will it come back to be damaging if people do it early career? There were comments about women and the project of knowing, and then the final comments about the UK and race.
Okay, I'll say a little bit about race, Latinos, et cetera. And this is kind of following up on the previous comment, which is that we've done a great job of showing that race is a social construct, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have in anthropology and other social science, well, anthropology is worse than others, but we have a deep comfort with the notion of ethnicity, which doesn't deserve scare quotes, but race deserves scare quotes when we talk about it. So ethnicity is a self-evident fact. It's something that we can talk about. It's readily recognizable and analyzable. Race is not. And so what happens with this notion that race is a social construct is that it evades theorization. And so then the question is, on the one hand, who can be a theorist, to follow up on John's question, but also what is deserving of theorization? And so race is often positioned as this topic that is not to be theorized. So to use Latinos as an example, of how we might re-theorize race. I mean, again, as I mentioned in my comments, I think we talk about moving beyond the black-white binary, which is just so troublesome, because often we talk about the browning of America and this kind of thing, and it really is about a displacement of a conversation around blackness rather than a reimagination of how race works. So we imagine race as a spectrum where you have a white and a black end of a pole, and then every other category fits in between that spectrum. But what if we reimagined race as a constellation of categories that can be reconfigured in powerful ways and oriented and co-constitutive of categories and related to one another, but not as a spectrum, because I think it doesn't get us very far. It doesn't help to tell us a whole lot about people's experiences of exclusion, inclusion, etc. So.
I just wanted to say thank you to Deb for your comment. I fully agree, and I think it, I need to think about it more, but I think it speaks to the larger question of we need to not think about Twitter as a kind of unmarked space, but a very marked space in social media in general, in which people are bringing their embodied experiences, their gendered experiences to the fore. And it has been, I need to think about it more because I hadn't really thought about it, but I do think we've seen a lot of sexuality activists also very involved and gender-based activists. So I think it's an important question, so I appreciate it.
Lee, do you want to comment on any of the questions or say anything further?
Yes, I would like to. I'm going to turn this. I would like to comment. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
I would like to comment about the fighting and repercussions, as well as sort of picking up on something that was said earlier about when not to use anthropology, particularly theorizing around race. This summer, I thought the Rachel Dolezal, I don't know what to, coming out party, if you will, a great example or a great way to sort of talk about the plasticity of race and identity, and that technically we're all from Africa, and you can claim blackness if that's part of your family heritage at all. But I got tore up in Twitter. I mean, people just came at just like right after me, like, how dare you can do that? And I thought a little bit that in some respects I miscalculated, because I didn't understand how identity, and that she was, kind of lying, or I used perhaps a wrong example to make a basic Anthro 101 point. But I do think we have to be careful, like Raymond said in the beginning, what we say does have repercussions. People actually read it, and we have to be mindful of the politics and the ethics of this powerful analysis, theory, and approach that we have the tools to use. And it was humbling. I think Twitter works in that respect because it enables people to really forcefully talk about an analysis in a really sort of safe space. But it also was an example for me where I probably didn't think through the ethical aspects of sort of making a point about anthropology. So I think we all need to be mindful, but move forward as well as we push our analysis into the public sphere.
John, Raymond, anyone want to say anything?
Yeah, I'd like to address the question of repercussions for activism, because I think it is a very serious question and one that would be good to think about carefully. What I tell my students, some of whom are here, is to be strategic but be principled, so that we want more people in the academy who have a social justice orientation. So this means often that if you're going to be active, you do your activism, but then you also have to meet the requirements of the academy, even if you don't particularly agree with them. And unfortunately, 70% of all classes in the US are now taught by adjuncts, as I think you pointed out. And this means that, first of all, they don't have freedom of speech, but it also means that tenure is kind of on the decline. Now, once you get tenure, you are usually able to be freer about what you want to do and what you want to say. But I think even while you're in the early stages of the career, you make choices and you decide how important something is to you. And I think you balance things out. You never be unprincipled if you can do it. And finally, I think it helps to develop a community. And how you develop a community depends on where you are. But you really need a community at your back so that when something happens, you have people that can help you out.
I mean, we're a little out of time, but if either of you want to say something, Raymond or John?
We're good.
Okay. Great. I just want to thank all of our panelists again, and thank Lee for bearing with us, and thank you all so much for coming. I just also wanted to see, I was passing around a sheet for people to note if they were considered themselves experts and would provide their contact information. So anyone know where that sheet is? Okay, I'll have fun looking for it after the panel. Oh, no, it made it all the way up here. Thank you. So if you do consider yourself to work on this topic, thank you. Please feel free to put your information down. Thank you all so much again. I really appreciate this wonderful dialogue.
Thank you so much.